will know, but maybe some folks online do not. This is the congressionally designated Week of Remembrance of the Victims of the Holocaust. And every year on our campus and the campuses around the University of Colorado, we do programming specifically, in our case, around the legacy of health professional involvement in the Holocaust and how that history continues to affect the way we think about ethical issues in health and medicine and society today. This programming is put on in large part in thanks to the people who support this programming. So I don't want to start without acknowledging the longstanding support of the Rose Foundation, which has been involved in this program since the very beginning. And I absolutely cannot start without acknowledging Dr. Bill Silvers, whose transformative gift really kicked this program off almost a decade ago, which is incredible to think. It's been almost 10 years. This program, just a couple housekeeping things. This program will be recorded, and the link to that recording will go up on our website. It will also be sent to everyone who RSVP'd to the program. For those of you online, if you want to participate through asking questions, please put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring the chat throughout, and we're going to start with a conversation with just the three of us, and I'll introduce our speakers in just a moment, but we'll start with a conversation with the three of us and then open things up both to people in the room and online after maybe 40 minutes? We're going to try and keep it to around 40 minutes. We'll see how we do with that. Also, last thing in terms of logistics, there will be a reception with the speakers in the art gallery right behind you all after this event. So please join us for the reception afterwards. So I am so very pleased today to welcome two really wonderful friends and colleagues to have a discussion about the legacy of anatomy and a particular anatomy atlas. And I'll first just introduce our discussants. Dr. Sabine Hildebrandt is an associate professor of pediatrics, and she teaches anatomy and the history of anatomy at Harvard Medical School and Harvard College. She received her medical degree from Philipps Universität. How did I do?
Beautiful.
All right. In Marburg, Germany. And she has been an extremely influential scholar in this field of research on the history of anatomical work in the Nazi era and its implications for today. She is also the co-chair of the Lancet Commission on Medicine, Nazism, and the Holocaust. Welcome, Sabine, to Colorado. Thank you for flying in.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Howard Israel is a recently semi-retired, that's my phrase. Is that correct?
It's undecided semi-retired.
He's an undecided semi-retired professor of clinical surgery in the Division of Oral and Maxillofacial Surgery at Weill Cornell Medical College. Clinically, he is well known for his work in the field of chronic orofacial pain and TMJ, temporomandibular joint disorders and arthroscopic surgery. But for reasons that you are about to hear about, we've invited him here today less for his clinical expertise and more because he has become widely known for his work on ethics and Nazi doctors. And I guess I'm going to start by just asking Howard to kick this story off with, a reflection on your training and the anatomy atlas that you used in your training. And, obviously there are half a dozen really good anatomy atlases. One was your favorite, and I'd love to hear why.
Well, the story starts for me in 1973. I was a 21-year-old graduate biology major entering my first year at Columbia University School of Dental and Oral Surgery. And 1973, the first class that you were required to take was anatomy. And it was, I'm told now that 8 weeks is a lot, but from 8 weeks from head to toe seemed like quite a challenge. And the challenge when you go as a student, you go into a cadaver lab. Remember, I've never seen a dead person before. And there are body parts and there's a smell. And aside from all that, trauma to yourself, I had to learn everything. And the required textbook, the required atlas that we had, it was called Grant's Anatomy. And I went to the anatomy lab with the professors with the full intention of really knowing this stuff. And my preparation was generally look at the atlas and then go to the lab and see if I can identify stuff. And it was grueling and it was painful. And I got through the course. I did okay, but at the end of the course, I said, I really don't know anatomy. The pictures that I was looking at and the anatomy dissection, I don't know anything. Yeah, I could pass a test. Great. Give me a patient, forget it. So I asked the anatomy professor, the professor, world famous professor. So, Dr. Professor, I have this problem because I really want to know this stuff. I know need to know this stuff. What do you recommend? He says, well, you really want to know the stuff, Pernkopf's atlas. There's nothing like that. I said, so why didn't you make it a required text? He says, because you can't afford it. Now it's 1973, and I looked up how much it cost. Now, the book cost at least the volume that I was looking for, head and neck, cost between $50 and $75 or something like that, which doesn't sound like a lot today. But you have to understand that in 1973, 74, just before I got married, and I told my wife about this, we were going to live on her salary of $7,000 a year. And we paid the enormous rent of $173 a month. And it was beyond my financial circumstances. But fortunately, my wife, Mindy, knew I really wanted to become a surgeon or get really to understand this. And she remembered the Pernkopf Atlas. And she was working at the IRS in downtown Manhattan. She was a revenue officer, closing bars. But anyway, she found her way to a medical school bookstore, picked up the Pernkopf Atlas for $50. And it was the greatest gift that I possibly could have gotten. When you opened up the book and you saw the anatomical dissections, it was nothing like the atlas that we had, which looked like a comic book. Here you could identify the layers and it was always my protocol to study before the real event. Fast forward, I used the book, became an oral surgeon. I made it my habit before every oral surgical procedure. It was my responsibility to know that anatomy cold, not only from the book, but possible deviations or possible, complications. And it was my protocol that I would open up the book, I would do the operation on paper from the very first step I walked in the operating room. And I would do every single step with that book in front of me, write it down the night before surgery, so that when I did the surgery, it was the second time I did the surgery. It became my protocol from going through oral maxillofacial surgery training, residency, and I used it, and then I became a member of the faculty at Columbia, and I was responsible for residents, and I made sure that I did that protocol every single operation, even if it's something I've done many times.
So this is an extremely detailed, extremely lifelike, realistic,
It was
far
like,
more so than Grant's anatomy is the one I used also.
don't operate on me, please.
Maybe that's why I did become a surgeon. So
That's why you went into
So-
ethics.
yeah. So Sabina, what do we know? And I guess I'm curious also, what did we know at that time? What did we know in 1970 about Pernkopf and this atlas?
I guess it depended on what you want to know. Officially, there was no discussion about the atlas other than the fact that it was the most popular atlas among anatomists and surgeons who wanted to know their anatomy for sure. And Austria was very proud of this world achievement of this atlas that was read around the world. It was at that time translated into English. It was ultimately translated into 7, 8 other languages. And it was praised by everyone who ever saw it because of its great detail and the beauty of the images that it showed.
Did people know who Pernkopf was? And when did that come out?
Well, you have to go back to Howard Israel. The public discussion on this topic didn't start before the 1980s. And it wasn't really public until Howard asked very intense questions.
So we put up a slide for the audience here and also online with a quote from Pernkopf. Can you give us some context for this quote?
Yes, so Eduard Pernkopf was an Austrian who in 1933 became the chair of anatomy in Vienna at the university there, and who already then in 1933-34 joined the Nazi Party and the stormtroopers, the SA. At that time, Austria was not yet annexed into Nazi Germany. It was still independent. But as soon as Austria was annexed in 1938, he was basically rewarded by the Nazi regime by giving him the deanship of the medical school. And you see him here in this photo in his welcome lecture as a dean. You see him giving, actually he is in his SA uniform and he's giving the Hitler salute, and you can see the enthusiasm of the students and faculty greeting him back. This is about, this is in March 1938, as far as I remember the date, so pretty much immediately after the Anschluss. At that point, he was already in the process of, according to Nazi law, removing the Jewish faculty and the socialist and communist faculty, which ultimately were 53% of all the medical faculty.
Just to be clear, Anschluss is the
Oh, the
annexation
annexation
of
of Austria, I'm so sorry, into Nazi Germany, exactly, March 1938.
And was this history known if you wanted to know it, or was he sort of was he did he disavow the Nazi
It was not
Party later?
internationally known at that, and not in the
70s.
1970s. It was certainly known in Vienna if anybody wanted to know, but people conveniently preferred not to know or didn't talk about it, as far as I know. Definitely a public first publications here in the United States came up in the 1980s, and then, as I said, a real public debate following Howard Israel's questioning.
Yeah. So Howard, how did you find out that the author of your favorite atlas was a pretty, I mean, 1934 is 4 years. So he was a member of the stormtroopers or the SA
And
4
that's-
years before. So this is very early in the Nazi era.
Well, he was a Nazi ideologue, right?
Yeah.
So
He's not just a member of the party. He's
no, he
a
believed
leader.
in.
He's a true
believed in
believer
this, yeah.
Nazi. When did you learn this?
Well, it was a very specific moment in 1994. At that time, I was on the full-time faculty at Columbia teaching oral maxillofacial surgery residents how to do surgery. I was preparing for a surgery that was going to take place the next day. I had the book open to anatomic drawing. That was going to help me prepare for the surgery, just like my routine was. And a colleague of mine and friend, Dr. Stephen Syrup, casually walks into the room and says, "How you doing, Howard? Da, 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 da. What you doing? Oh, I see you're reading that book. Hey, I heard Pernkopf was a Nazi." And my world went upside down. So here I am. I've used the book for 21 years. There's a casual comment by a colleague of mine who leaves the room, he didn't see my reaction, but my gut felt it. And I'm saying to myself, 21 years I've used this book. My training, my most precious book, my training came with the aid of the knowledge in this book. I treated patients. I taught oral and maxillofacial surgery residents. I prepared, and I'm looking now at not just anatomic pictures, but people. And I looked at this page, and I look at this page, and I say, "Oh, the guy is cachectic, and his hair is shaved, and is it possible that I was looking at someone who was a victim of the Nazis?" Because I knew nothing. I knew the name Pernkopf. He could have been from Yugoslavia at that time. So my first reaction was, this is something I can't resolve in my gut. Fortunately, I was at Columbia University, and I went down to the stacks and found the 1937 and 43 editions of the Pernkopf Anatomy Atlas written in German. And I open up the book and I start slipping through the pages, and I'm going through the pages, and I'm seeing some of the same diagrams and paintings. And then I noticed that the artists signed their names, many of them signed with Nazi swastikas or the SS symbols. So there were Nazi icons throughout particularly the 1943 edition. And I'm saying, okay, now what? And I didn't really know what to do. I mean, I was totally befuddled. I've never been confronted like this before, but it struck at the core of me as a professional. So my first thought was, well, maybe this was a concentration camp victim. I don't know. So I went to the people in my temple. I went to the Anti-Defamation League and said, how do I find out about this? Well, the folks at the Anti-Defamation League in New York said, well, the first thing you got to do is you got to get from the Berlin Document Center, Pernkopf's dossier. And I got it, and it's all written in German, so I don't understand any of it. But one of my temple members, his name is Kurt Kellman, he should rest in peace. Turns out Kurt Kellman was in Vienna in 1938 and was a bar mitzvah in the only synagogue that has survived the Nazi era. He opened his arms and helped me out, and he translated these huge documents for me. And then I read Gerald Weissman's book article, and I read Williams' article about that they did know about Pernkopf, and it was known. I went to any source I could find to try to figure out what to do. Finally, my rabbi recommended I read this book by Robert Lifton called Nazi Doctors. And this is now 1996. No, was it 96? I think it was around 96. Maybe it was before, but it turns out that I read the book about Nazi doctors that talked about all the terrible things Nazi doctors did. And just by luck, Robert Lifton was going to be the guest speaker at the Yom HaShoah program at Columbia University. And so, having some chutzpah, I call the guy up and I say, I'm going to attend your lecture. By the way, how are you getting to Columbia? oh, you're taking the subway? No, 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 I'll pick you up. I pick him up, and I didn't bombard him with any questions or anything. I just got to know him, very nice gentleman. He gave a great talk. At the end of the talk, he sat down with me and I said, I have something specific I want to talk to you about. And I mentioned this. And he says, you know, I don't really know where you should go with this, but there's a guy in Ontario, Michael Cater, who's a professor of medical history, who wrote a book about Nazi doctors, and maybe he can help you. And I spoke to him, and he said, there's only one person that you really need to speak to, and that is Dr. Bill Seidelman. And Bill Seidelman and I got together. He was my first email friend. We started emailing back and forth, back and forth. Bill had a history of something similar like this occurring in Tübingen in Germany in the late 1980s, where the students found out that they were learning on Nazi victims. Bill led the effort to knew just what to do. And from there, it became a Yad Vashem appeal, and we eventually wrote an article in the JAMA, the Journal of the American Association, and then it took off.
I want to put up one of the other pictures we have from inside the atlas, because I'm guessing the version of the atlas that you had, the English version, did not have the Nazi iconography, or it had some of it. So Sabine, can you just describe these two images and give us a little of this history?
Yeah, so from what we can reconstruct at this point, the first American edition came out in 1963. And my library has one copy of that 63 book, and I have another copy. Turns out the library's copy still has some of the swastikas and the SS runes, whereas in my copy, which clearly is a later printing, some of the swastikas, but not all of them, have been retouched, so that we assume that somebody after the first American edition saw the swastikas and said, you have to remove them. And so in my copy, they had been removed in the book itself, in the printing plates, most likely. However, I had also heard that the originals had been retouched. And this is what you see here. In 2019, I went to the publisher that by then held the copyright of the Pernkopf Atlas, which actually publication of the Atlas stopped after Howard's and Bill Seidelman's intervention. But the copyright was still with Elsevier, the very large publisher, and they have a dependance in Munich. So I went to them because they actually had the originals of the Atlas images, which are watercolors. And what you see in this image on the left side is one of the original watercolors with Erich Lepiers. That's the name of the medical illustrator, Erich Lepiers' name with a swastika, where he adds also the city of Vienna. And in the next one, you will see that this is another original, another image. Somebody has gone into this watercolor and has picked away, when all watercolor paper is very rough, they have picked away with a very fine needle the fibers of the paper that carried the pigment in the downstroke of the swastika. So they retouched not only the printing plates in the American books, but they also retouched, and most likely for the third German edition, they were retouched in the original.
David, can you go now to the next slide, which is the one with the JAMA article, and maybe tell us, because I think we've heard what your reaction was. Can you tell us what was the reaction of others? Because you sort of picked the people that you wanted to go approach about this, and they were your rabbi, and they were, you know, Robert J. Lifton and Bill Seidelman and Michael Cater. Outside of that realm, what were the other responses? What was the response of the general public when this letter came out in JAMA?
Well, the responses were varied. The initial inquiries that went to the University of Vienna, anatomists were mostly of denial, and the publisher, most of the denial was, well, these were not Jewish concentration camp victims. That response was the most appalling thing to, I think, to both me and Bill that you possibly could have imagined. Like, oh, well, if they were other Nazi victims, then I don't really care. They were victims. I, unbeknownst to me, was using this book, and I did look back at my most used book, and you could see the icons were erased. So I had no knowledge of this, and I benefited, and my patients benefited from the suffering of those people that I was looking at. And to say to me, and to say to Bill Seidelman, and to say to the world, well, as long as they weren't Jewish, it should be okay. I mean, what kind of moral compass can a doctor have if that doesn't bother them? And so that was an appalling response. And fortunately, once the JAMA article came out, the JAMA publication really orchestrated mostly, between Bill and I, but the main things were, who were the victims? We want an investigation. Number two, if any of them were victims of the Nazis, they needed to be buried in a proper ceremony and honored. And three, in all future publications of the book, there needs to be an acknowledgement of that there were victims in this book. That was the call from us. Now, one of the other responses were, some people said, bury the book, don't publish it, hide it. Didn't really like that. Personally, wasn't my reaction, because that's what you would do, like burning a book. We don't burn books here. It was there, it's out there, let the truth be known. Let's learn from it.
Sabine, the letter on the right of this image was, I guess, briefly inserted into the issues of the book. What happened after this in terms of how did the publisher deal with this?
So this was actually a letter from the University of Vienna to all libraries in the world to insert into the Pernkopf Atlas about the historical background of the atlas. It also informs that the bodies of executed victims executed in the civilian and military prison system had been delivered to the Vienna Anatomy and might be shown in some of these images. We never know exactly which of these images might show victims, but we do know that Vienna Anatomy received more than 1,300, or at least had assigned more than 1,300 executed victims, most of them actually resistance fighters. So mostly for political dissent were they executed. So that is what that letter informs. And I'm pleased to say that your library here has that insert, but this has been superseded by 20 years of more, nearly 30 years of more research by now. And we have more information on the subject matter.
Yeah, so tell us more. What have we learned about these victims? What can we know? Because it sounds like there was some dispute about whether any of these were Jewish Nazi concentration camp victims, political prisoner victims. Is there any way now still to trace this?
So the intervention by Howard Israel and Bill Seidelman ultimately resulted in a very thorough historical investigation in Vienna. It was ascertained that more than 1,300 bodies of executed persons had been assigned to the university. 7 of those were definitely of a Jewish descent. The rest were really victims from all over Europe, of varying religions and national backgrounds. Their identities, there is a list with their names, but we actually are currently in a situation where I understand the Vienna University is once again looking at the entire cohort. They're starting another, as far as I know, there is another investigation ongoing to learn also about possible victims from the patient murder programs and so on that might have been delivered to Vienna Anatomy. Because at that time, in the connection with the Pernkopf Atlas, they did not look in detail into the other possible Nazi victim groups. We do have information for the other 29 anatomical institutes, nearly all 29. We have 20 of the 29 other institutes. We have information on the fact that there were bodies of persons who committed suicide, bodies of persons who were murdered within the patient murder programs and so on, were delivered to the university. So I understand that Vienna is wanting to look into this history once more. The other thing that happened is that the Pernkopf originals have been returned to Vienna. They are now part of the archive of the Medical Museum in Vienna, the Josephinum, and they are part of an exhibit there about the history of the medical university in Vienna. And there are a couple of publications that I just gave to your librarian here that will be inserted nowadays into the Pernkopf Atlas.
So I hope this is not an insensitive question, but to some extent, were the practices that were used in terms of using people who had committed suicide or prisoners who had been executed, was that common throughout the world? Was that unique to the Nazi era?
No, it was not unique to the Nazis. It was actually, when you look back at the history of anatomy, the first anatomy laws that exist at all started in the 12th and 13th century in Sicily, where bodies of the executed were gifted to anatomists to do one dissection every 5 years. That's how often they dissected. So throughout the years, this changed. From the 16th century on, we have in the England and Scotland laws that allow for so-called unclaimed bodies, bodies of persons who were not used for, who died in public institutions and were not claimed by their families or friends for a burial. We see that coming up more commonly in the 18th century, including then actually from 1832 on, also in the United States, the first law in Massachusetts on unclaimed bodies. And they always included also, with few exceptions, also the bodies of the executed. So that was traditional law. And that was the excuse that the anatomists like Pernkopf had when they said, well, this is all regulated by laws. We've always been doing that. In fact, though, that executions started to escalate during the Nazi years, especially during the Second World War, where we have an exponential rise of executions to, 100-fold more than in the years before. The anatomists just conveniently chose to ignore, because they actually wanted these bodies. They were the most quote unquote valuable bodies you could possibly have in anatomy, because they were bodies, they were fresh. They were usually of young, healthy, muscular people, because they were young resistance fighters.
So what has happened in terms of the memorialization of these victims? Where did this letter lead? So we saw that it led to the insert. What else did it lead to?
Well, I think the main thing it led to was the ethical debate by the individual clinician. Do I use the book if it can help a patient? Or do I not use the book because it came from such evil? Can you create good from evil? Do you justify evil by using the book? And I have to tell you, for years, I kind of grappled with that question personally, because now my clinical practice preparation changed. You know, I didn't want to look at the book, but I did want to look at the book. And I always cut down to the question, you know, patient asks you a question, what would you do if it was your son? And I always came down to the question, what if I had to do an operation on my son and I needed the knowledge from that book, would I use it? And I just couldn't resolve it. There was no resolution in myself. I kind of finagled it a little bit. I would peek at the book. I would draw my own anatomic diagrams in preparation, but it was not really resolved. I stopped pretty much, you know, using the book unless if I felt I needed to. But the main thing was that when I used the book, it was with a different sense of understanding what I was doing. That I was looking at someone who was a victim. And I think that ethical debate has continued by many clinicians. And I think it led to what I think you're going to talk about the video.
Yeah, we have a couple other images. Why don't we show the image of the burial ceremony, and maybe you can, either one of you can give some of the background on how this came about.
Well, my understanding is that after the senatorial project that investigated the specimens at University of Vienna, they looked at all the specimens that they had, and they concluded that anything that might have been from a Nazi victim was to be collected, removed from their educational collections, and buried in a ceremony. And if you look carefully at the picture, there's a rabbi, there's a priest, and it was not a religious ceremony per se, in that it didn't presume any ethnic or religious provenance, but they were all victims, and that was the common theme.
And then the other image, David, if you could just switch to the one with the Josephinum, just so people can sort of see. And Sabine, you alluded to this a moment ago, that there is now an exhibition in the Josephinum. And can you say a little bit more about this? And if anyone wanted to go here, could anyone just walk in and see this?
Yeah. So, but it's in its historical framework. So basically what you see here is the building of the Josephinum, which is the traditional medical history museum of the Medical University of Vienna. It holds various collections, and one of them talks about educational materials that have been created over the years and their ethical background. And this is very important. And in this context, one of the originals is shown, the one that you see here, and it is shown in its context with the history of the Pernkopf Atlas. And this goes back, this is quote unquote ethically justifiable, because we speak about, or we show this image here in this context only in the connection of speaking about the victims and that they and their particular history. And those goes back to another clinician who, like Howard Israel, has had the same experience of having to use the atlas for her surgeries. That's a master surgeon, Susan McKinnon at WashU in St. Louis. She is a peripheral nerve surgeon, and she has learned to see with a Pernkopf atlas, and she needs it sometimes to identify nerve fibers that she can't see in any of the other atlases. But she was just like Howard Israel, just like Professor Israel. She was just as bothered by this history. She knew about it, and she asked us to find an authority to speak about this question in a medical, ethical manner. And we were lucky enough to have Rabbi Joseph Pollack, who himself is a childhood Holocaust survivor, and one of the few rabbis who has expertise in not just Jewish medical ethics, but also in the question of what to do with human remains. And he was willing to look into the halachic sources that spoke to the use not only of human remains, but also of data, like the images that derive from these victims' bodies. And he came to the conclusion from the authorities that he studied that we can use these images in exceptional cases under the Jewish principle of pikuach nefesh, if we can save or better human life, but only in the context of truly always speaking about the victims and their dignity, to put the dignity and respect for these victims at the center of any use of these bodies. And in this context, we can look at this image. This is why we're able to see this image here today. Otherwise, we wouldn't have shown it.
So I guess my last question, and then we'll turn to the audience, is I can see ways in which this history and the lessons that have been taken that are specific to this atlas might be applied to, as you've just said, broader issues around unethically obtained knowledge, data of all kinds, tissues of all kinds. And I'm wondering now about outside of medicine, even, there are museum collections, the Mutter Museum in Philadelphia, and even, I guess that's a specific museum designated for this kind of thing, but even regular museums might have tissues or remains, skeletons, skulls of indigenous people, of, how has this, or has this history affected the thinking outside of medicine in the sort of museum culture?
So in terms of the indigenous human remains, that discussion is an older one, and is actually one of the few that is regulated by law. For the last 30 years, it has been regulated by law, that these individuals need to be identified and returned to their respective communities of descent. We're just starting on having this wider discussion, really internationally in all collection settings, in teaching collections, but also in museum collections. So that is an ongoing discussion. And here, indeed, these lessons that we have learned in the context of the Nazi history are finally being asked for. And we see parallels with other discussions around the collections and human remains from other histories of historical violence, really, in this context. And we see many parallels here. And I could go on and on because I've been discussing this for the last few weeks with many people, but I don't think we want this at this point.
Well, I will turn to the audience and see if there are any people in the live audience who have questions. Matt?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for a really interesting, albeit I would say somewhat somber presentation. I appreciate what you've shared. And one question I had was, to what extent did this cause people to turn their gaze onto the other atlases that are out there, which I assume, or I don't mean to assume, but imagine might not have been curated in the most ethical of ways? What do we know about other atlases that exist?
Wonderful question. A colleague at the University of British Columbia is currently working on another atlas that has a similar history. That's a breaking story that I can give you more information on, but it's her story to tell. It concerns the Spalterholz Atlas that had post-war editions that include Nazi victims for sure. And of course, we have to ask, that's a valuable question that not enough people ask. Any of these traditional atlases come from a historical background that by today's standards would not be considered unethical. At a minimum, they were, most of them, if not all, well, actually all of them, are based on unclaimed bodies, right? So that's something we need to realize, and that's something that the pioneer really in ethics of anatomy, the New Zealand scholar Gareth Jones formulates as anatomy sitting on the edge of of any culture that allows it. We are always on the edge of things that are allowed and that are disallowed. And we need a public discussion at a minimum about all of this. So thank you for that question.
Other questions from the online, if we go back and forth?
So this one is from James, and it says, do you think that neurosurgery trainees who use one of the Schattenbrand stereotactic atlases, I might have just destroyed that, are made aware of the history? What do you know about what?
So the Schaltenbrand stereotactic atlas, I'm not familiar with. I do know of the Schaltenbrand experiments, where Schaltenbrand was a psychiatrist in or neurologist at Würzburg University, where he looked in, and I'm trying to get the story together, but basically it was human experiments on psychiatric patients during the Nazi period. So the Schaltenbrand experiments are definitely considered unethical from today's point of view. I'm not familiar with the stereotactic atlas. There I would need to look into the specific history where these stereotactic data came from. But this would be separate from the Schaltenbrand experiments.
Yeah, Helen.
Alternatives to using an atlas? Are there any other ways of being able to study the composition of tissue without using a cadaver?
Nowadays, we have many ways of studying human anatomy without the body, the real human body. But you're talking here to an anatomist. I want to work with a real human body, and I want to work with a donated human body that has been donated by the person themselves, if at all possible, based on the principle of autonomy and consent. I believe in a world that's becoming more virtual by the minute, there is nothing that can possibly replace the human body and what it can teach us. And we bring our students, very different from the experience that we had in the 1970s and 80s. We bring our students into the anatomy learning environments with our donor bodies with the utmost respect. And our students who come in there with a good heart, as you know, we make sure that they retain their good heart in this work, that they learn the balance between distance and closeness. We like to start them early. There's a whole new world in anatomy that we are creating, a new bioethos.
Is there another one online that we should go to? And then we have a queue in the room.
One of the questions online is, were any of the victims children from the T4 program?
That's something that needs to be found out.
How will they find that? How do you find that out?
Historical study, you need to go into the archives and look at the patient data. It can be done. Whereby children probably would have been killed within the children's euthanasia, which is a little bit different from the T4 program, but it's let's call it patient murder programs. It can be found out. It's a lot of work. You need historians and you need funding, but it can be done.
And there were
And I'm speaking here specifically about Vienna, right? We know this for some other anatomies.
That's what I was thinking. There were known victims of the patient murder programs who were taken directly
yes.
for dissection, specifically to study specific brain.
That's neuroanatomy, and that's neuroanatomy, yes. And that also happened in Vienna in a different institute, yes.
Along the same line of discussion,
What do you think of, how do you handle the information that you receive, that you learned from the experiments that were done on Holocaust victims? And how do you, I mean, you must have learned there were a lot of lessons that were learned. How do you treat this information?
I think that you become very skeptical of the information that you're getting, and it's important to know the source and try to find the source. You know, if you're reading a paper, nowadays we have very intense informed consent and IRBs to try to protect people. But if it's an older publication, you know, how do you find out? Is the data, A, is it good data? B, is it tainted? Did it originate from an unethical source? And there are many cases of data that's been out there. Rausch's experiments on the hypothermia victims, and many others, most of which that we couldn't go into too much detail, but their publications from some of those experiments got into our literature and was used. But today we're more sensitive, and we try to protect with the IRBs and the and informed consent. But you have to look at your source.
Sabina, you may want to jump in on this because we've
Yeah, I
talked
mean,
about this before also.
the plain fact is that the data were used. I mean, the United States sent people into the concentration camps to collect the data from the medical experiments, from the first paper, the first collections of these data collected by US personnel were sent in October 1945. October 1945, they had a whole collection of the medical data and sent them around to specialists in the United States for evaluation whether the data could be used for other purposes. One of these specialists was Henry Beecher, as an anesthesiologist who was supposed to give an assessment of the mescaline experiments that were conducted also in Dachau, like the Russia experiments. So that's a plain fact. They were looking for data, were looking what was usable. And I'm still thinking that maybe Henry Beecher got some thoughts about what also in terms of mind-altering drugs, what he did with his own experiments in the 1950s, which ultimately led him to his famous publication in '65 in the New England Journal of Medicine. Data from, for example, the phosgene experiments were used as late as the 1980s by the EPA here in the United States. And I know this from research done by my colleague Florian Schmalz. So in fact, they were used. And I couldn't agree more with you, Howard, on we need always to look at the sources of the knowledge that we gain from especially older papers, but also newer ones, right? We need to look at the ethical background. At least we need to ask for transparency.
Oh, sorry. Do we have one online? I promised to go back and forth, but okay, James, you're on.
To bring this more into contemporary time, some of you may have seen the opinion piece in the New York Times today about the unethical, repetitive vaginal exams on anesthetized women. And this was, of course, brought forward by medical students. So my question really to you is, to what degree do you think current medical students and dental students are made aware of this particular terrible history to inform them of these things that go on right now?
Well, that was one of the thrusts of the Lancet Commission on Medicine, Nazism, and Holocaust, that we develop curricula that can be brought into the various health professions educational programs, starting with, like a 30-minute intervention up to whole semester courses, whatever we're capable of bringing into the curricula. We're trying our best at this point. But I also must actually say, even if our medical students are not necessarily informed about this history yet, they come to us with the questions, right? They come to us with the questions, just like the ones with the vaginal exams here. We have our big look into the anatomical, the inclusiveness of anatomical representation goes back to a question when a student came up to me and says to me, I do not see myself up there on this Netter image that shows the forever white male slender person, right? I'm Black and female and I don't see myself there. Ever since this question and many questions similar from our students around the world, we are working now on inclusivity in our anatomical representations and really reconstructing also how we represent the human body and anatomy.
I can speak for the dental community, having taught in dental schools and oral maxillofacial surgery residents for over 40 years. I think there's progress that needs to be made.
Oh, yeah.
And, because I've served as curriculum chair and as academic dean at some schools, and I have the only exposure in the curriculum and experience that I've noticed was either something that I was talking about in my teachings or something that was generated by the student body. But not necessarily and fortunately the students are bright and they ask these questions, but I think we have a long way to go.
Yeah. The other thing that I learned just really that dawned on me, there are now medical humanities programs that are being created in colleges. And this is where there's more room for this. And they are really asking for this kind of history. So we have to look at the colleges and the medical humanities programs.
Probably fit in one more question from the Zoom.
Looking back up for it, I think this is an interesting past, present, future question. Supposing that the atlas were altered or tweaked with AI, would that still be problematic given the original source of the information?
Yes, because AI is only as good as its sources.
It would be the same thing as erasing a swastika.
Yeah.
It'd be worse. I mean, just we live in a hopefully a more sensitive day and age. That would be very disheartening.
That seems like an excellent point to close on. Let me remind you all that there is a reception in the art gallery right next door after this. I also have a copy, an original of the 1963 Head and Neck Atlas, which I'll bring down for people if you want to see what this thing actually looks like. It is quite incredible, and it's worth seeing. Thank you for joining us. I have to make my last plug, which is if you enjoy programming like this, please donate to our program.